Okay, let's unpack this. It's a 10-gallon hat, the American West.
Mm-hmm.
But South America has its own legendary figure, a skilled horseman, sure, but someone whose story is, well, much messier, far more complex, and their legacy is just deeply woven into the national identity of multiple nations.
Yeah.
The Gaucho.
That's absolutely right. And for this deep dive, we're really tracing the evolution of the gaucho, or, gaucho in Portuguese. It's this tremendously potent folk symbol across a huge area. We're talking Argentina, Uruguay, southern Brazil, Paraguay, southern Bolivia, even southern Chile.
So our mission today really is to understand the scope of this transformation.
Mm-hmm.
How did a figure initially labeled by, well, colonial society as a marginalized outlaw, a social menace even, someone they actively tried to sort of erase, how did they become resurrected, often, long after their historical disappearance, as this quintessential romantic national icon? We're diving into a pretty comprehensive stack of sources here to try and get quick but thorough insight into this really profound shift in cultural identity.
And we absolutely have to start with the definition because, honestly, it reveals the complexity right from the get-go. The Dictionary of the Spanish Language tells us that historically, a gaucho was defined back in the 18th and 19th centuries as a mestizo, so a person of mixed European and indigenous ancestry.
Okay.
And crucially, they were a migratory horseman, highly adept in cattle work. That migratory part is key.
And that historical distinction is so important because the term itself has evolved, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Today, especially if you're in Argentina or Uruguay, it often just means any country person experienced in traditional livestock farming. Kind of.
Yeah, sanitized.
Yeah, the rough edges seem filed down into this, well, benign description of a rural worker.
But the word still carries that heavy metaphorical baggage, It reflects the gaucho's contradictory reputation. On one hand, you can use the term to mean noble, brave, and generous, especially in military contexts.
Right.
Yet it also implies someone skillful in subtle tricks, crafty. It acknowledges those outlaw origins we're about to really get into. And in Brazil, the term gaucho has even become this sort of metonymic marker referring to any citizen from the state of Rio Grande do Sul, regardless of their connection to ranching.
Wow.
It's an identity that just spans geography, race, centuries. It's huge.
That sheer scope across so many countries, it really suggests this figure is truly foundational. Okay, let's start with maybe the most opaque aspect then.
Yeah.
The name itself. We're jumping into section 1. The name and the outlaw origins. And it kicks off with, well, a baffling etymological mystery.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Despite the figure's massive cultural importance, we can't even agree on where the word gaucho came from. Seriously.
Yeah.
By 1933, one researcher had already counted 36 different origin theories.
36.
And that number is now believed to be over 50.
50 theories. That's staggering. And the ultimate conclusion from the sources seems to be that there's basically no documentation of any sort that will fix its origin to any time, place, or language. This lack of certainty is itself kind of woven into the romantic mystique, isn't it?
Exactly. And many of these theories are, well, what the etymologist Joan Coromines just dismissed as not worthy of discussion, just conjured up because a word sounded vaguely similar. You get these amusing suggestions trying to link it to the English gawky or the French gauche, maybe reflecting how uncouth early European observers found them.
Which, while amusing, it does speak to a pretty deeply ingrained European colonial bias against that rough, wandering lifestyle, doesn't it?
Precisely. But okay, 2 theories are taken seriously. The first is this resemblance theory. It connects gaucho to the Quechua word huacho or huacho, which means orphan, abandoned, or maverick.
Okay, that fits the profile.
It fits the sociological profile, of the marginalized wanderer on the periphery. But linguistically, the transformation needed to get from guacho to gaucho is apparently quite improbable. And it doesn't really explain the Brazilian spelling gaucho with the accent.
So if that's the weaker theory, linguistically speaking, which one holds up better under scrutiny?
Well, the most compelling and linguistically plausible argument is the dialect frontier theory. This was proposed by the sociolinguist José Pedro Rona. And this theory grounds the word's origin exactly where the first documented gauchos actually appeared, in those lawless borderlands between Spanish and Portuguese influence. We're talking the Rio de la Plata basin, specifically northern Uruguay and southern Brazil.
Right, that makes sense geographically.
Mm-hmm.
Those early mentions in Spanish records often link them directly to smuggling hides in that exact turbulent border area.
Exactly. So Rona argued the word likely started as a derisive indigenous term, maybe from the Charrua people, called Gaucho, and it meant something like old Indian or contemptible person, basically the ultimate low-status insult. Now, here's the key linguistic jump. The Portuguese-based dialects common in that border region. They apparently struggled with the Spanish R sound, so they rendered it as a strong aspirate H, effectively turning Gaucho into something like Gahucho.
Ah, I can almost hear the word forming now.
Yeah.
Right. And that aspirated H sound, that Gahucho, would have been difficult for the native Spanish speakers of the time, encountering the term from the Portuguese side.
Correct. Native Spanish speakers, either unable or maybe just unwilling to reproduce that harsh H sound, simplified it further. They used a null sound or maybe a J sound, which leads directly to Gahucho, and then eventually the accent shifts to Gaucho.
Wow. So the term literally started as an insult, a derisive term for a contemptible person in the borderlands, which perfectly validates that initial low status.
It does, and that leads us straight into the brutal historical reality that stands in such sharp contrast to the later Romantic myth. The first official mentions of gauchos, or sometimes gauderios in the 18th century, they're damning. Colonial authorities identified them clearly as outlaws, cattle thieves, robbers, smugglers, just a constant nuisance to stability.
They weren't exactly pillars of the community then.
Not at all. Felix de Azara, who was one of the foremost naturalists and chroniclers of the late colonial era, writing around 1790, he flatly called the gauchos the dregs of the Rio de la Plata and of Brazil. He said they weren't interested in settled life or legal commerce. They were primarily interested in the contraband trade in massive quantities of wild cattle hides, living this highly illegal, itinerant existence.
One scholar summarized the gaucho of that time simply as a colonial bootlegger, just fundamentally reprehensible in character, exceedingly low social standing, outsiders really, existing entirely beyond colonial law, responsible only to their own sense of justice.
And yet, even then, you see the seeds of their future utility, maybe. The Spanish administration, recognizing their innate skills, actually recruited its anti-smuggling forces, the Corpo de Blandengues, from among these very outlaws.
Using the poachers to catch the poachers.
Pretty much. It hints at that dual nature, right? Troublesome, yes, but possessing undeniable martial and equestrian skill that the state would eventually desperately need.
It's still hard to imagine that level of social contempt flipping all the way to national pride. What specific event or societal change forced the colonial elite to start seeing, value in these dregs of the Rio de la Plata?
Yeah.
I mean, here's where it gets really interesting. How does society's view of an outlaw bootlegger flip so dramatically to a national hero, someone you could put on propaganda?
Well, that fundamental transformation really began with the wars of emancipation and independence, starting around 1810. Suddenly, those vast open plains became the perfect battlefield for guerrilla warfare. And the gaucho's inherent skills, his bravery, that extreme mobility, his superb horsemanship, they were no longer a social nuisance. They were a priceless military asset.
He was recognized as a born cavalryman, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Perfectly adapted to the terrain, possessing this intimate knowledge of the plains that regular European troops just lacked. Leaders like José Gervasio Artigas in Uruguay and Martín Miguel de Güemes in Argentina, they relied almost entirely on these mounted irregulars.
Yeah, their success in lightning-fast guerrilla warfare, raiding supply lines, vanishing into the landscape, refusing pitched battles, it forced the Spanish to begrudgingly admire their military prowess. General Garcia Gamba, who actually fought against Güemes up in Salta, he left behind this really telling account of his admiration.
What did he say?
He noted that the gauchos approached the troop with such confidence, relaxation, and coolness that they caused great admiration among the European military men. These regular soldiers were seeing men who lived by the knife and the horse, demonstrating, as he put it, excellent qualities for guerrilla warfare that just surpassed formal military training.
Wow. So professional soldiers impressed by these, outlaws.
Exactly. And the sources highlight a really crucial turning point here. The moment the Spanish tried to weaponize the term gaucho as an insult against the patriot militias.
Okay.
Güemes immediately flipped the script. He proudly adopted it, referring to his own troops as my gauchos. He turned the insult into a coveted badge of honor. And that right there is the definitive first step in transforming the pariah into the national protector.
That's a powerful moment. So once independence was won, Did visitors start noticing this culture more? We have these marvelous, detailed snapshots from travelers right before the culture was, well, systematically dismantled by the new governments.
We do. Emmerich Essex Vidal, who was the first artist to actually paint them, he noted their extreme mobility back in 1820. He described this truly independent spirit. He observed that the Gaucho never developed any attachment either for the soil or for a master. They were so independent, they'd just leave a job at any moment without warning, often just saying something like, "I am going because I have been with you long enough." That profound resistance to settlement and authority, that's core to the legend.
But that fierce independence, it was coupled with a tradition of really profound hospitality too, wasn't it? Vidal noted they'd lodge and feed a traveler for months without questioning them or charging a single coin, kind of a necessity on those empty plains.
Absolutely. And then you have Charles Darwin traveling the Pampas in 1833. He spent 6 months observing these countrymen. He found the country gauchos very superior to those who reside in the towns. He thought they were obliging, polite, hospitable.
There's always a but with Darwin, it seems.
There is. He added the crucial counterpoint that speaks volumes about their internal culture. The habit of constantly wearing the knife. The facon led to frequent bloodshed and, trifling quarrels, sometimes ending in death over just an insult or a misplaced word.
And Darwin also suggested that the sheer abundance of food and horses, that it actually killed industry. He identified the root of their reputation for indolence, too. Universal gambling, much drinking, and extreme indolence. He even cited 2 men who wouldn't work, one saying the days were too long, the other claiming he was too poor. Did the state later use this idea of gaucho indolence to justify cracking down with vagrancy laws?
Oh, absolutely. Darwin's observations, even though they were somewhat sympathetic to the gaucho's character, they provided the perfect moral ammunition for the urban elites later on. The sheer profusion of wild cattle, the ease of getting food and transport, it removed any real economic incentive for them to settle down and participate in the state's vision of ordered commerce. This refusal to be governed, that was the real problem for the new states.
So we had this really paradoxical figure emerging. Noble, brave, supremely skilled, yes, but also a lawless gambler prone to sudden violence and, crucially, unwilling to be tied down to a wage economy. And that last part, that unwillingness to be tied down, that became the existential problem for the emergent Argentine and Uruguayan nation states, didn't it?
Exactly. Which brings us to that mid-19th century push to control the wandering gaucho. The independence wars were over, these massive cattle estates, the estancias were growing, and the freely roaming gaucho, he transitioned from being a military asset to, well, an economic threat and a legal nuisance. Landed proprietors needed salaried peons, not mobile, armed casual laborers who might just leave.
So the state struck back institutionally. In Argentina, they systematically intensified vagrancy laws, starting policies under figures like Rivadavia and Rosas. These laws mandated that all rural workers had to carry employment documents, right? A papeleta de conchavo.
That's right. And if you were found without papers, you faced mandatory military conscription, often for years, serving in these highly dangerous frontier posts fighting indigenous groups.
That sounds like a pretty raw deal. Forced labor or the army?
It was, and this systematic legal effort, it resulted in what scholars call the proletarianization of the gaucho, forcing them into dependent, salaried peon jobs on an estancia. But the freedom-loving gaucho, well, they resisted fiercely. This led to massive desertion rates from the military and forced labor. The sources actually estimate that renegade gauchos deserters comprised up to half of all the Indian raiding parties on the frontier.
Wait, up to half? That is an astonishing detail. They were literally joining the people they were supposed to be fighting, having fled military service or persecution, choosing the life of an outlaw renegade over state control and settled labor. Wow. That level of resistance really underscores how devastating these new laws must have felt to their identity.
It does. And the cultural polarization of the era, it's perfectly captured by Lucio Victorio Mansilla. He was an Argentine general, but also a writer. And in 1877, he detailed these 2 distinct types of gaucho that he saw within the soldiers under his command.
Okay, so he divided them into, the useful citizen and the romantic rebel?
Pretty much. The first type was the paisano gaucho. This was the country worker. He had a fixed abode, regular work habits, respect for authority, and he leaned towards civilization. The cultivator, the drover, the peon. Useful for industry and the future of the nation, in Mansilla's view.
And the second type, the legend.
That was the gaucho neto, the out-and-out wandering criollo. This was the man who lived for universal gambling, was habitually quarrelsome, an enemy of discipline, and, notably, an enemy of foreigners, the gringos. His only luxury, Mancia said, was his spurs and his facon.
And Manciera concluded.
He concluded that the paisano, the worker, made up the majority of the Argentine social mass by then, while the gauchonero, the figure we tend to romanticize, was already disappearing. The wild one was on the way out.
Okay, before we move on to the sort of final death blow for that gauchonero, we need to pause and contrast this intense river plate system, Argentina-Uruguay, with the situation further north in southern Brazil and maybe the Uruguayan borderlands. The social structures were quite different there, weren't they?
Yeah, that contrast is really essential for getting the full picture. For one thing, slavery was legal in Brazil until 1884, much later. And the sources note that in this region, maybe even a majority of the permanent ranch workers, the mounted camperos as they were called, were actually black slaves.
And what's really interesting there is that these black horsemen often apparently enjoyed sharply better living conditions than slaves working in the brutal sedentary conditions of the beef salting plants, the charqueadas. Why the difference? Is it just because ranching required mobile workers who were harder to supervise?
That's a huge part of it. Ranching requires highly mobile workers who are difficult to constantly supervise and who have ample opportunities to just escape across borders, especially in that fluid region. So paternalism in this case was simply the most economical policy to try and retain skilled labor.
Makes sense.
Plus, the border region itself remained lawless and fluid much longer than central Argentina did. Powerful Brazilian Uruguayan families like the Saravias, they led major mounted insurrections in both countries, with conflicts lasting right up until the early 20th century.
So this maintained a more martial, maybe more paternalistic, and certainly more violent gaucho culture for longer. Less subject to the strict labor controls coming out of Buenos Aires. There's that famous satirical cartoon from 1904, right? Depicting Aparicio Saravia saying it's time for another little revolution. That perfectly illustrates that prolonged instability.
It does. But even there, state consolidation was ultimately inevitable. The mobile, lance-wielding horsemen were eventually defeated by Uruguayan troops armed with modern Mauser rifles and Krupp cannon, deployed much more efficiently using telegraph and rail. Technology and state consolidation were closing in on the gaucho way of life everywhere, sooner or later.
That sets us up perfectly for Section 3, the end of the frontier and those extreme skills. The state had tried to control the gaucho politically through laws and war, but what truly killed the nomadic lifestyle was, well, a combination of social engineering and a simple piece of metal wire.
Yeah. The Argentine elite made it an explicit foundational policy. It was enshrined right in the 1853 Constitution, encouraged massive European immigration, and the purpose was openly stated to supplant the lower races of the interior, including the backward gaucho, who they just viewed as obstacles to civilized commerce.
This was the view championed by intellectuals like Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, right, who saw the gaucho as brutal and feckless, and Juan Bautista Alberti, who famously summarized the government's modernization strategy with the maxim, to govern is to populate, basically bring in Europeans.
And the demographic results were instant and profound. A flood of immigrants, huge numbers of Italian farmers and laborers especially, altered the country's ethnic composition so rapidly that by 1914, something like 40% of Argentina's residents were foreign-born.
40%.
Yeah. The Criollo and Mestizo culture of the gaucho was intentionally diluted out of social and political existence.
But the true physical catalyst, the thing that really ended the nomadic life on the ground, was cheap, mass-produced barbed wire. Once that became readily available from about 1876 onward, fencing the vast open pampas was suddenly economical. And this technology, maybe above all else, eliminated the need for gaucho cowboys.
Right. The fencing completely disrupted the ancient cattle drives. It forced gauchos off the communal lands they knew. It just changed everything.
Yeah.
This physical change confirmed the observation made later. The gaucho of today is no more a real gaucho than is our own present-day cowboy, the cowboy of the Wild West. Both have gone forever in their original form.
Wow. But before they vanished, we really have to appreciate their singular signature attribute. They're just breathtaking skill on a horse. The skill level was absolutely essential to survival, wasn't it? Reflected in that cultural saying that a man without a horse was a man without legs.
Completely. The horse was their universal tool. They used horses for everything. Collecting, marking, driving cattle, hunting the incredibly fast-moving rias, the nyandu, even drawing fishing nets from horseback, getting water. The sources even report they were assisted by friends to ride to their own burial. The horse was just an extension of their body and mind.
The legendary prowess is hard to overstate. Juan Manuel de Rosas, the Argentine dictator, He was reputed to be able to throw his hat on the ground at a full gallop and then scoop it up without ever touching the saddle with his hand. Just an incredible feat of balance and raw athleticism.
And that kind of supreme confidence and daring, it led to some truly terrifying, yet apparently spectacular equestrian sports. Things often banned by the colonial and later national elites because they were just so dangerous and seems like pointless displays of bravado.
They weren't just dangerous. Some sound downright suicidal. Take Pachando. This involved two horsemen charging each other head-on at full speed.
Head-on.
The resulting collision just tumbled both men and horses in a cloud of dust, flying limbs. And the goal was simply to recover quickly, remount, and charge again until exhaustion or injury forced a stop.
Yeah, it wasn't about winning a prize or anything. It was a pure psychological test. A display of courage, absolute indifference to death traits forged in that lawless existence, and probably pretty useful for guerrilla warfare, too.
Or consider the maroma. This involved jumping from a high bar, like off a corral gate or something, onto the bare back of a racing wild horse or steer that was driven underneath, and then staying on until the animal was either completely broken or, in some cases, killed by the effort.
Again, tests of mastery over life and death on the open plains. Way beyond a typical rodeo challenge we might think of.
And another particularly dangerous trick was PLR. One man would gallop through a group of other gauchos, and they would use their boleadoras to lasso the horse's legs, instantly throwing them out.
Right, trip the horse intentionally.
And the rider was required to land perfectly on his feet, still holding the reins, ready to leap back onto the mount instantly if it got up.
That sounds absolutely insane and kind of unnecessary unless it serves some crucial function. Why practice a guaranteed crash landing?
Well, apparently it was a crucial survival skill on the Pampas. The plains were riddled with these vizcacha burrows, large, deep holes made by rodents. If your horse was suddenly thrown by stepping in one of these burrows, which must have happened constantly at speed, you had to land ready, unharmed. Losing your mount while alone out there on the pampa, that meant almost certain death from exposure or thirst. So PLR was like an extreme way to inoculate the rider against panic in that exact situation.
Okay. Training for the inevitable fall. That makes a brutal kind of sense.
The dedication to the horse even extended to aesthetics and status. I love this specific cultural detail about the gaucho's passion for his tropilla.
Right, the tropilla. That was a man's meticulously curated string of riding horses, usually a dozen or more, and he insisted they all be of matching colors. All chestnuts, or all duns, or all silver grays. This was a huge status symbol, a real point of pride. It distinguished the wealthy or successful gaucho from just a mere peon.
The sad conclusion, though, is that once the gaucho was marginalized, pushed into settled labor, these extreme skills quickly became obsolete, didn't they? The modern ranch hand, the salaried peon, probably couldn't sit a really bad horse in the same way because that finely honed life-or-death skill just wasn't essential anymore for daily survival in the fence-based economy.
Yeah, it faded. Which brings us nicely to Section 4. Culture, symbolism, and the modern legacy. This is the story of the resurrection of the man who, in his authentic, dangerous form, no longer really existed. But first, let's quickly detail his physical culture, the tools and items that really defined him.
Okay, first and foremost has to be the facon, right? That long dagger sword.
Yeah.
It was often his only eating instrument, sure, but primarily it was a weapon, synonymous with those Darwinian knife fights and that legendary bloodletting.
Definitely. And then you had the boleadoras, or boleadas in Portuguese, those 3 leather-bound rocks tied together with straps, swung with incredible precision to trip cattle, horses, even rheas by entangling their legs, a unique tool of the plains.
Their attire, too. It was perfectly adapted for mobility in the harsh environment. The versatile poncho, doubling as a blanket, a saddle blanket, rain gear.
Couldn't live without the poncho.
And they wore loose-fitting trousers called bombachas, or sometimes a diaper-like wrap called a chiripa, all cinched by a wide sash, the faja, which was sometimes decorated with silver coins to show wealth.
And their social life, it really revolved entirely around the pulperias. These were the rural general stores, but also taverns and often fences for stolen goods. The pulperia wasn't just a shop. It was like the central nervous system for that lifestyle existing outside state law, selling everything from yerba mate and liquor to tobacco and horse stack.
Thub.
Absolutely. And speaking of mate, their diet was, well, simple but hearty. While out on the range, it was almost entirely beef. consumed as asados, these large cookouts over an open flame, often using pretty much an entire carcass spitted on a frame.
The famous Argentine barbecue originates here.
It does, and the ubiquitous beverage was mate, that bitter herbal infusion, sipped communally through a metal straw, the bombilla, from a hollowed-out gourd, and sharing the mate gourd without cleaning the bombilla between people was a key sign of trust and brotherhood.
So this is the figure, rough, deadly, skillful, independent, socially excluded, that the forces of modernity, the state, immigration, barbed wire, systematically dismantled. And the profound irony, the real kicker, is that it was precisely that disappearance that allowed urban intellectuals in the 20th century to turn him into a pure national myth.
Exactly. This myth-making, this glorification, it was a direct cultural reaction against that massive European immigration we talked about. Intellectuals like Leopoldo Lugones and Ricardo Giraldes, they were searching for, or maybe creating, a pure Argentine identity, something untainted by the chaos and perceived materialism of the foreign influx. And they painted the gaucho as the essential, pure national symbol.
The irony here is so rich, it really requires some unpacking. They chose to celebrate the galloping hero, the gaucho neto, the rebel, not the settled, useful immigrant farmer, or even the compliant paisano gaucho worker. Lugones in particular, he canonized Martin Fierro, the rebellious protagonist of Argentina's national epic poem, as the true national hero who somehow civilized the Pampa with his fierce individualism.
But here is the massive, almost hypocritical twist the sources reveal. Lugones, while celebrating Martin Fierro, simultaneously argued that the historical gaucho had to disappear because, in his explicitly racist view, the gaucho's Indian blood contained an inferior element.
Wow. So celebrate the myth, erase the man.
It was a classic attempt by the elite to appropriate the ideal of the heroic fighter while explicitly rejecting the historical mixed-race man and the, frankly, uncomfortable reality of his outlaw origins.
That speaks volumes about how politically charged this icon became. Even Jorge Luis Borges, himself a deep student of Criollo history, was pretty skeptical of this romanticized choice. Borges criticized the man on horseback as secretly pathetic, a kind of passing storm that left nothing permanent behind. He consciously contrasted the gaucho with the settled cultivator, the farmer, the person who actually gives us the fundamental humanizing word, culture.
But the genius of the myth, perhaps, is its malleability. Because the real gaucho was already extinct, or close to it, the icon could be used by pretty much everyone. Darker-skinned Argentines felt validated because the gaucho's non-white ancestry was too well known to be entirely hidden or denied, while the traditional white elite used him to affirm their own legitimacy by claiming the heroic mantle of the nation's past, conveniently forgetting the parts they didn't like.
And, politically, the icon has been constantly contested, hasn't it? Shifting dramatically depending on who's invoking him. The military dictatorship in Argentina in 1978 used the gaucho in this really sanitized propaganda for the FIFA World Cup, projecting an image of an orderly, disciplined, peaceful country. Very pisano.
Yet at the very same time, the left-wing Montoneros guerrilla group was using the gaucho as a potent symbol of the rebel tradition, harking back to those lawless independence fighters, the gaucho neto. So the gaucho can represent pure order or pure resistance, depending entirely on who is holding the poncho, so to speak.
That's fascinating. So where does that leave the culture today? Does it persist, especially outside that original River Plate basin?
It definitely persists, particularly in southern Brazil. There, the Movimento Tradicionalista Gaucho, or MTG, is this incredibly powerful, largely nostalgic, and essentially urban movement now. It claims millions of active participants who actively foster gaucho culture through major festivals like the Semana Farroupilha.
Millions? Wow.
Yeah, it's huge. The MTG really exemplifies the modern role. The spirit survives through traditional dress, the cookouts, churrasco or asados, and especially the oral traditions like the payada. That's where performers known as payadores engage in these fierce, improvised verse duels, keeping that tradition of verbal artistry alive. It's amazing to watch.
And while barbed wire did end the traditional nomadic life, the modern role has evolved too, right? Into skilled ranch hands, maybe guides for tourists looking to experience a version of the lifestyle the South American take on the dude ranch.
Exactly. Horsemanship remains important, both out of necessity in some rugged terrains, but also as a conscious homage to the culture. It's about keeping the skills alive.
And we're even seeing the gaucho ideology, that concept of living in harmony with nature, sustainable practices, inspiring modern environmental movements today, promoting things like grass-fed beef, ecotourism.
That's right. The legend has found a new kind of utility in a world increasingly worried about ecological balance and maybe looking for alternatives to industrial agriculture.
So in synthesizing this whole journey, we've traced the Gaucho from, well, a linguistic mystery and a social pariah through that brief but crucial period of military glory to being systematically erased by the forces of modernization, fences, immigration, laws, only to be resurrected after the fact as this incredibly complex, politically charged national symbol.
Ultimately, the gaucho really joins his global counterparts, the North American cowboy, the Venezuelan llanero, the Chilean huaso. They all show us that this tension between a romanticized, often violent past and an industrialized, controlled present is a common defining theme across basically all horse-based frontier cultures worldwide. It's a universal story in many ways.
So what does this all mean then? The Gaucho Neto, that fierce wandering loner, he was effectively eliminated by barbed wire and mass European immigration. Yet his myth, his icon status, was only truly created and canonized after his disappearance, after he could no longer actually steal cattle or engage in knife fights or fundamentally threaten the centralized state or the new economic order. Which raises, I think, an important question for you, the listener, to ponder. Does a nation primarily build its deepest identity on the useful, settled worker, the paisano? Or does it build it on the idealized rebel, the Gaucho Neto, but only once that rebel can no longer actually threaten the ruling classes or the status quo?